Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another Sponge Chat. My name is Jim, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you here once again. As usual, I had the pleasure to sit down with a well respected expert within her field, Fatime Losonci, and we spent a good hour speaking about or looking at her perspective on assessment, which is something that we've touched briefly on in some previous chats. So, for example, when I spoke to Tom Kiddle, we looked at teacher education, but one of his specialisms was assessment. So we touched briefly on that there, um, and within this chat we went deeper. Though we looked at sort of assessment from a global perspective, and we looked at two very important terms: so assessment of learning and assessment for learning, and perhaps the differences between these. And we also looked at why that as teachers, maybe we should be more concerned with assessment for learning, um, because of the impact that it has on our students and the impact that it has on shaping the course itself. We also sort of diverted a little bit and looked at something that Fatima is quite passionate about, and that's teaching skills or teaching sub skills. And for many of us, this seems common sense, but we looked at something that many teachers often struggle to identify, and that's the difference between what we might call testing and teaching skills. And Fatima was kind enough to provide some examples there. This led us on to speaking about her course, which is to develop teachers' abilities to teach skills within an IELTS focus, but still quite applicable to general teaching as well. I got a lot out of this chat, and I had a lot of fun um, speaking with Fatima, going into these details, and because assessment is something that's really interesting for me. It is something that I haven't actually read a lot on. You will know that I read a lot, but assessment is one of those areas where I've I've touched on briefly, but haven't gone deep into. Whereas Fatima, this is something that she's obviously focused on for a number of years and has gone quite deep into. So I got a lot out of this chat. I do hope that you were able to get something out of this as well. I'd love to hear your feedback, as I'm sure Fatima would. So please leave a comment, get in touch through the blog or on LinkedIn. I do respond. Well, without further ado, let's get into it. I hope you enjoy, and I'll see you next time. Hi, Fatima.
Hi, Jim.
Thank you very much for taking time out of what I imagine is a very busy schedule to be with me here today. If I remember correctly, you're based in the US, right?
Yeah, that's not so true right now. I'm commuting between Merida, Mexico. So I'm currently in Mexico, to be honest. So yeah, this
Okay.
is there. I don't know what's happening with this, to be honest.
You're still a long way from me. Well, I'm
Yeah.
based in Spain. So, I mean, what time is it there?
It's just 8 a.m. So I have kind of had to have a huge cup of coffee to really wake my brain, to be honest. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I mean, it's what is it? It's 3 o'clock here in the afternoon. Um, but yes, thanks. So again, thank you very much for being here today. Before we get into all the goodness, as usual, I'll give a brief spiel about Sponge Chats. So, for those that are listening or watching for the first time, Sponge Chats have I can't even remember when they started. It must be 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago now. I don't know. And it all started with this idea of mm, trying to raise awareness of how teachers, wherever they are in the world, could move into different positions. It started with teacher education, teacher training, and it's branched out into everything. So speaking with freelancers such as yourself, or looking at materials writers or editors, it's developed into a much bigger thing than what I expected it to be. And really, the idea is that we give teachers or EOT professionals some ideas of the avenues that they can take so that they do stay within this industry. Because yourself included, I imagine, we love this industry, and it's a pity at times that it's not as professional as it should be. So that's how I see sponge chats. But that's enough of that. Let's get on to all the goodness for today. As usual, I start with a big question: Who is Fatime?
I was afraid you're going to ask that. Yeah, that's context dependent because, like you were talking about, how teachers, after a couple years of experience, they come to the same crossroads, right? So we start asking, do I go into teacher training, materials design, academic management? And some of us do all of these, maybe not at the same time because that is really overwhelming. So I've been in the industry for 20 something years. I don't like to admit it because it really ages me, but I have done these other branches of VLT that you mentioned, and your channel really supports teachers with a couple of years of experience who are just going through the brainstorming stage to kind of figure out what's next for them. And currently, I like to identify as a teacher trainer, materials writer, and item writer. So that's
Mm.
three hats, but grouped together um, around helping teachers and writing and the assessment, which I love so much.
Yeah, I mean, assessment seems to play. I mean, we're going to be speaking a lot today about assessment. I mean, the focus mainly is assessment, and that's a massive part of your identity now, as an EOT professional. But how did you? So where did you start? So before we get into all the sort of the assessment focus stuff, how did you move from teaching into what it is that you're in today?
Yeah, so I love to challenge myself. I love to learn new things. I like to say that I'm a recovering learnaholic, and I mean it in the sense that I really get carried away. I get super interested in new courses, new skills, new languages, and I have come to a point in my life where I had to realize that I have to give skills priority over just knowledge,
Mm,
not skills priority over, you know, um, so it's not an either or, but I really want to move away from for myself, and I think the world is going in this direction as well in a way, to just focus more on skills and applicability, and
mm,
therefore I am more judiciously looking at a new skill, a new language, a new course these days. Hence the recovering idea, and I look at whether it has any immediate utility for my life and whether I should really do the thing, whether it's gonna, you know help me practice the thing right away. So one
mm,
example is before the pandemic, I love psychology. So before the pandemic, I signed up to take the GRE in psychology, which is a graduate exam that people who want to do a master's or a PhD in the US mostly do in the subject. And I had no plans to go do a PhD right after. I wish I could, but um, the pandemic started. I had my exam paid for. I had bought the books. I had prepared. I had booked the hotel and everything because it was in Merida, where I actually am now, but I wasn't living here at the time. And I'm realizing now that it's really better to kind of focus on skills and keep the curiosity, because yes, I'm still a super curious person, too much so in a way. So I'm into anything to do with language acquisition, psychology, history, and as you can see, these are very diverse subjects on their own, right?
mm,
So I don't think I'll live forever. So I really have to be a bit more selective about what I pursue. Is what I'm noticing. And exams. You were asking about how I got into assessment as well.
mm,
Kind of were a learning organizing tool from early on in my adolescence, really. So I set out to do the Cambridge Advanced because I'm a non-native speaker. So I prepared for that, and I figured that signing up for prep courses with a reputable organization and good teachers was a good path to achieve that, because they would provide, the school and the books and the qualified teachers. They would provide a comprehensive curriculum for me to follow, and then it really worked out fine. So I did the advanced, I did the proficiency 20 plus years ago, and because this recipe was working just fine, I thought I'd apply the same with Spanish, and then I kind of put it as a beacon, kind of an organizing tool, a goal to get to the same, so the Della Superior, so the C2 level
mm,
um, Spanish as well, and I did that, and this is, yeah, how I started with assessment through language assessment, but I'm kind of exploring and I'm trying to read and find out more about assessment in general, which is a whole other beast. It's a much bigger scope in a way, and it's very exciting.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you touch on some very interesting points there about also from a learner perspective, looking at the importance of exams for learners, whether it's a goal or whatnot. And I imagine we'll come back to that later in the talk. Thinking about assessment, specifically, how would you define assessment? And I know that we're it's a very difficult question to answer. Um, but if you were to give us broad strokes, what do we mean by assessment within language education?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, and that's why it's a good one, because it's so broad and it opens up so many doors and so many questions for discussion as well, and it should be discussed, I think, by educators and I think it is, especially because the future is looking very, kind of very exciting and very um, confusing and interesting with chat GPT and AI and computer adaptive testing and all this jazz that's coming and is kind of making me watch very closely as well. But I think assessment is what we make of it, so it's really um, up to us and key stakeholders to decide what is the purpose here, and this is exactly why it's so difficult, because then there is sometimes confusion, um, and we say we assess for one reason when in reality we are using it, which is what I saw in a Central European context, to be honest. We use it as a tool for discipline, or to
Mm,
win punished, or to um, so that's not quite right. So I think it's okay for a test to have multiple purposes, and the valid ones, in my understanding, is to find out what the learners know, what they don't know, where can we help them, um, to see how motivated they are or what else could motivate them. So we could tweak the the test itself if we find that it's kind of the test experience itself is not really motivating or not really exciting for the learners, which is kind of ambitious, I realize, because when we hear the word test or exam, we tend to become really stressed.
mm,
But we shouldn't, because I think tests are fun. That's how much of a geek I am. I do think they can be a nice challenge, and we can also assess, to monitor progress, to check if our teaching is working, to report back to external stakeholders.
mm,
So, two, three, four different purposes at a time. If we are conscious of them and then we create and or choose the right product for the purpose, then probably that's a good situation.
mm.
um, and then we haven't even talked about when we are assessing, so whether it's before instruction, during or after. And I'm a huge fan of during, because assessment of learning is a bit too little too late. I mean, it's a good thing to set as a goal, for example, a language exam, um, which is what I was doing with, for myself as a language learner, and I was proposing the same to my language learners over the years. So when people
Yeah.
found me, and they were like, I just want to improve my English, and I was like, wonderful, we will prepare you for the Cambridge Advance. And they were like, what is that? Why do I need it? And often they didn't, in leading positions at companies or other, but committing to the exam, paying for the exam, you know, reverse engineering the schedule around the exam, looking at models, and suddenly things became more serious and more organized in my experience. So, after instruction is valid in that sense, but during instruction is my favorite, because there is, um, so they're so connected and they shouldn't be separated, because a
Yeah.
lot of is wasted. A lot of wonderful data, and information is wasted if we really just, we've been doing something in the classroom for half a year or a year, and bang, there is a test at the end. You scored this and this. No feedback on why you didn't score better in that paper. And off you go. I think that's a shame, because it's exams should be exploited more for learning. And yes, by the way, they are a good way to measure whether we've achieved the goal, or but I'm more of a believer of using them as an organizing tool, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, you touched on two very important concepts around assessment of learning and assessment for learning. Um, I think most teachers, and myself included, going back maybe 5 or 6 years, um, would be most familiar with perhaps of learning. So there's the test that we're going to give to our learners to see, how much they more a summative assessment, right, where they're going to see how much they've learned. And I really like the point that you mentioned that there's so much potential for them for learning to assessing within the course or whatever it might be, and using this as a diagnostic tool, an organizing tool, shaping our teaching or modifying the syllabus, and so that they're really really important. I think they're also quite challenging for some teachers depending on the context they work to implement these if there's not institutional support. But yeah, really really important. um how Thinking about other challenges around assessment, because you also mentioned different perspectives. So you mentioned that it could be from the teacher to the learners, but we could also think about other key stakeholders. What do you mean by key stakeholders and how they come into the equation?
Yeah, key stakeholders tend to be parents, universities, um, other people other than the learner or the candidate themselves. So assessment is embedded into some sort of a social context and some sort of a learning context. So if you just look at IELTS, for example, we know that candidates preparing for the exam are doing so because they are going to study biochemistry in Australia, or
Mm,
because they're going to study mechanical engineering in London, and in that case, um, it's embedded into this whole context where the university accepts IELTS as a valid, test, which kind of signals that there is enough here in terms of academic skills, English language knowledge, and skills for this candidate to do well enough starting out in their master's and PhD programs.
mm. Yeah, yeah. There's so many people involved with the number of like the exam boards, right? There's so many perspectives involved, um, and it's quite interesting to think about that there's more than just the teacher and the learner, right? And I think one of the I remember I was in a workshop a few years ago now, and one of the instructors, they said, How many people here, how many teachers are preparing their students for the C2 proficiency, the Cambridge C2 proficiency?" And a lot of them put their hands up, and me included. And they asked us, "How many of you have actually done it?" And all the
Mm.
non-native teachers have actually done it, and then all so the natives hadn't done it, right? And they said, "How many of you can actually pass it?" And it's interesting to see this perspective sometimes of how, and I think this is one of the challenges that come up with teachers actually understanding the learner's perspective of the assessment. Is that something that you would agree with?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is why this whole talk around native, non-native. I'm just so happy, by the way, that we're moving away from the native
Mm,
hegemony. Because one of the reasons why I'm not living in Spain is that I'm not a native speaker. In my 20s, I was desperately looking for a job and I couldn't land one because all the ads at the time were asking for a native speaker. So I was like, okay, this is clearly not happening. I gotta go to Mexico. And I made, a wonderful life here, and I have been here for 11 years or so. And we're moving away from it as we should, because non-native teachers who have acquired the language. So, I'm really kind of demanding high in that sense that when I talk about non-native speakers, I still want them to be as close to fluid and fluent and proficient as possible. So
mm,
I want to defend their rights, um, because because I understand the language schools and those stakeholders who, the parents who are paying a lot of money for a language course for their children, and they get a teacher who's a native speaker and speaks on a B2 level, and that's really not an ideal scenario. I understand it is sometimes the only possible option in certain contexts, but yeah, the best is when somebody really understands the exam from within and exams in general. So if this would actually be maybe a tip to native speakers as well, to learn a foreign language, to look for the internationally accredited language exams in that foreign language. So if it's the Span, if it's Spanish, then the DELE exams. If it's French, I think it's called DALF. And you will get a close enough idea, sometimes not um, completely equivalent, because the DELA exams are integrated skills. So I had a much harder time preparing for the DELA C2 than the Cambridge Proficiency for the same reason, because I think it's a harder exam. Um, and it's not really representative of the proficiency, but it would have, if I was a native speaker of English and if I had prepared for this Spanish or French exam, I would have an idea of how stressful it can be, how many things and sub skills are involved, how time management matters, how the kinds of question types, how there is a plethora of question types across exam products. So that's one idea. And the other is to seek out opportunities where we prepare students. So to, if we're working for a language school, to not shy away from our director of studies coming and proposing that we teach an exam class, even if we haven't done it before, because there is always a first. But to just say yes and rely on the handbooks on Cambridge's website. That's what I did when I was new to an exam. I downloaded the handbooks. They're super useful. I'm so grateful that
Mm.
Cambridge have them up on their website free of charge. You just look for the PDFs, and then you go into the classroom. You rely on a course book, which will probably not be perfect, but it's good enough for until you figure out the ins and outs, the mechanics of that level. And and then when you feel confident enough, then maybe get some CPD more officially, maybe from Cambridge Assessment
Yeah, yeah.
themselves.
Interesting. You touched, I mean, all of this stuff that we're talking about now is links to this idea of, assessment literacy, understanding what it means to be assessing and the rubrics and all this sort of stuff. Um, are there any ways that perhaps as teacher educators, teacher trainers, should be looking to develop teachers' assessment literacy?
Yeah, well, these two tips would still stand, and then um, signing up for and maybe getting an employer to sponsor it partially or fully for official, really reputable providers. And I am not getting a commission. I wish I was from Cambridge Assessment, but I'm a huge fan of their courses. They're really straight from the horse's mouth in many ways. And I didn't do A101, introducing the principles of assessment, or A102, introducing assessment practice. But I did do A103, introducing data literacy, and A104, psychometrics in educational assessment, which was way over my head. So if I had the time and the energy, I would probably want to do that. But it's a nice series of courses, and they offer shorter ones, free webinars. They also have a newsletter to sign up to. So if we are interested, if we are curious, we are returning to the same idea of curiosity.
Mm.
Um, there are options out there, but as it is always the case, we need to really pay attention to quality and make sure who we listen to and
Mm.
who consider a credible source. So this is what I was saying about your channel as well, that it is really good quality, and we just, the challenge though for teachers, novice ones as well, is that they sometimes lack the criteria to be able to even say what they can trust and what is
Mm.
not so credible. So um yeah, then maybe going to the source, to the very source, and just really browsing Cambridge's website and Cambridge Assessment's website can be a really good strategy. And of course, to read the books, to read the classics and the newer ones, and to realize, because I'm noticing this as well, talking about literacy, assessment literacy, to realize that there is more to all this jazz than just writing multiple choice questions. Because number one, we have to be clear about our purpose. Number two, we have to realize that writing good items is much harder than what sometimes what we do for our lessons, perhaps hopefully not for actual assessment purposes. Because for a test or even an item to be reliable, valid, um, fair, practical, these are the big four ideas, and to even have positive backlash, uh, it has to be very well thought out. So, when we just set out and we just write our garden variety multiple choice questions, and then we write distractors, so the wrong options that are clearly wrong, that are not even plausible, then that's already kind of an issue. So
Mm,
I don't think teachers sometimes realize this from what I can see on social media and in the comments, etc. And then we haven't even talked about the mathematics, the psychometrics, the you know the statistics, the calibrating, equating, all this that goes into it all. Um, so I'm in awe since I have done AO4 in particular. I really see the territory now, and I
mm,
see how I know, because what I know is really just item writing, and even there, I really needed help from my editors. Um, when I was writing the books, and even exams for a European exam board. I really needed my editors to lend me their eyes and say,
yeah.
hello, this is totally plausible, or where is this rooted in the text? So for a distractor to be good, it has to be rooted somehow, and it has to be plausible at first.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's much more to it, and I'm not always sure whether teachers understand all this, as I didn't either.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned quite looking at the like the item writing process. Perhaps we can go a little bit deeper into that. So basically, an exam board, like for those that are unaware of it, I know that Cambridge has a very intense sort of process. So for each exam, it generally takes them about 2 years from for the process of the exam creation, the testing, the calibration, as you mentioned, the refitting of the exam, if you will, and then to get it out to the public. Um, Going into the item writing specifically, uh, how much leeway do you have with that? Like, do they give you sort of objectives that we want a text with this many multiple choice questions, or we need some kind of sentence rephrasing sort of task, and then you have pretty much as much leeway as you want to go with that, as long as it fits in with principles? Is that how it works?
Yeah, it will really heavily depend on the exam board that you're working for and the kind of
Mm,
product. So I used to work for, I used to write exams for Euro Exam International. So they are mostly Central European based. And I loved working for them because it was a skills only exam,
mm,
much like IELTS. So I really got to see how much harder it is to write skills items, um, how much more nuance, how much systems, what we call systems, so grammar and vocabulary matters, because you're not supposed to use super complex language on an A2 level. Um, but it's not what we are testing. We are not testing discrete lexical items. We are still
mm,
testing comprehension or reading comprehension. So um, there will be differences between exam boards. Yeah, with Euroexam International, there was a lot of emphasis on not using um, real life facts and factual information. So everything has to be fictional or fictionalized enough so
mm.
that we're really creating valid exams, and we are not really favoring students who know of that subject
Yeah.
as a who don't. So that's one example of a massive minefield and a trap that we
Mm,
can easily fall into if we're just fabricating our own exams for our own classroom, for example. And there isn't much talk of that. Just but at the time when I was working for them, there was a lot of talk of this, and then I compared it to IELTS, and I don't always see this with IELTS. IELTS does use academic
mm.
topics that are, if you are an architect, and if you are reading an architectural text, well, good, wonderful,
Yeah.
how lucky. So, but then again, we get this question a lot when we are preparing students for IELTS. Um, what can we do if we are not architects? And there is some architectural technical vocabulary. Well, that's when skills come into the picture. If we
Mm,
have done our job, or if our teacher did a good enough job, and we learned how to infer meaning, how to really work with the context, how to employ interactive processing skills, but very very fast. So like locating the section and then zooming in on just that one paragraph, that one sentence, feeling confident enough to ignore difficult vocabulary, or the opposite, knowing that this funky word here that I don't know because I'm not an architect is probably what I need to fit into this gap if it's sentence completion question or a labeling one if we're labeling a diagram or whatnot. So
Hmm.
um, yeah, again, depends on the product, depends on um, so many things, but it's
Mm.
interesting to deep into different products, different principles, different and at the bottom of it, it's still a magical process.
Mm.
So just in terms of vocabulary, I mean, the Common European Framework reference only speaks in can-do statements, and it doesn't say that the word regurgitate, you know, is not an A1 level piece of vocabulary, but we kind of know from experience that it's really a, maybe C1, C2. So there is the Pearson's global scale of English as one tool, and English. What's the other one? So to help us gauge the level of
Mm.
particular when we are writing. But then again, if we are writing IELTS, which I haven't officially done, so I have written my IELTS materials and my IELTS teacher training materials. But I imagine that because it's not a pass or fail exam, but it's a different construct, it's 0
Yeah.
to 9, you're not, your hands aren't so tied when it
Right.
comes to understanding items in an A2 or an a B2 or whatever. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
another angle. Mhm.
Interesting. I mean, now you've just touched on an important aspect of today's talk, I think, and that's the idea of the developing skills for exams or skill development for exams. Um, what for teachers that are perhaps new to this idea of developing skills? Also, we have the skills and the system separation there. But for skills for exams specifically, what do we mean by that? And what are perhaps some of the things that maybe we need to be careful of when we're trying to teach skills, if you will, and perhaps not test them?
Yeah, well, I'm loving the awareness here because this is not my usual experience, obviously. Um, Teachers, depending on their contexts, um, sometimes don't even realize that vocabulary is not a skill per se, um, or grammar isn't a skill per se. So, but then again, this is not their fault, and this is this can be easily remedied by CPD options, even free of charge ones like watching your channel or reading blogs, etc. So yeah, one thing we could do um, to develop skills is that we should teach them. So as you said, instead of just testing them, following a CELTA or other entry level kind of um, class map, where we just set a GIST task and then we lead into the subject somehow. We set a GIST task, then we set a detailed task with 10 different items, and then we give feedback on whether they were right or wrong. So we really focused on outcome and results, and that is still testing, and it's better than nothing, but it can potentially be demoralizing and lead even to fossilizing and bad habits, so to speak, if we just rely on administering past papers and blindly follow a course book that might be in many ways lacking or limiting. So what actually teaching would mean is to focus on a micro strategy that proficient users of the language also use. And it's very challenging to kind of pull it apart, because often when it comes to skills, we do many things at a time, like we were talking about interactive processing for IELTS. So it's
Mm.
really hard to isolate them, but if we don't isolate a sub skill, we won't be able to go deep enough, and we won't be able to expose the learner um, to enough exercise in the same lesson which are really working on that sub skill.
Mm.
um, that's very challenging, I realize, but it can be done, and people who have the Cambridge Delta and have passed the skills assignments will have somehow learned this, or have had their eyes opened to the fact that it is challenging. It's more challenging than teaching systems,
Mm.
partly because of the materials available or not. Um, but it shouldn't, serve as an excuse for why we are not doing it or why we are not doing it well enough, in my experience. Yeah.
Yeah, I can 100% completely agree. Um, I think within the especially within academia, obviously things have changed a lot. Sorts of research that focuses on skills development and taking into account SLA findings over the last 40 years and so on and so forth. But I still find that at least at teacher level, at least within the European context, which I train, there's still this kind of PPP sort of approach to most classes. Um, Many course books now are changing. In fact, they're including elements of like an electrical approach or a task-based approach, which is great because the course books have a big role to play in that. But there's still difficulties with teaching this idea of sub skills. Even knowing what a sub skill is, I'd be like, wow, great, you know that. So maybe we can give some examples. If we're thinking about the four skills, what would be a sub skill for some of them? Can you think of something? Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, yeah. For example, um, a bad or kind of a limiting and oversimplified and too kind of shallow writing lesson is where we ask our learners to write a full academic essay. Um, and then we just collect it, or we just get them to check and assess each other in pairs. And it's not going to go very deep. Maybe they pick up on issues to do with, hopefully, if we kind of give them a checklist of some sort or others. Obviously it's still us teaching the class, not getting them to teach each other. That's not enough. But instead, if we just spend one lesson around examining what is a thesis statement and how to write one in light of what the actual question was, and that starts by understanding the what I call the subgenre, so the kind of essay that was required by the task, which in IELTS, in the case of IELTS, it can be, and this will vary from exam to exam. So this is how we really have to be kind of aware of how, for IELTS, the job is to understand whether it's an opinion, a for and against, a solution, or more of a what I call a discursive essay, where we just discuss the subject from a more neutral stance,
Yeah.
in more journalistic fashion, without taking, without expressing our opinion, unless it's a hybrid, in which case it's kind of a more a trickier structure. So we have to kind of examine everything and only in the conclusion kind of include our opinion at the end. So writing a good thesis statement and therefore getting a good task response grade and a good coherence and cohesion as well will very much depend on this sub-skill, whether at this stage, at the brainstorming, outline writing, and whether we did a good job as candidates. And many
Mm.
candidates don't, because they're clueless about the kinds of essay, what a thesis statement is in English, probably because in their L1 they have different writing conventions entirely, which is kind of true for me. And Hungarian, my mother tongue, isn't so insanely different from English. But in its, well, that's not, not it's in structural terms and other it is, but just in cultural terms, it isn't so far off. So
Mm.
yet I experienced that in Hungarian academic writing, we like to kind of tease the reader a bit more. We don't like to be so explicit in our introduction and say, this is what I'm going to be talking about. This will be my final conclusion. If you care to read the rest, you're welcome to. Um, in Hungarian, we don't. Maybe I'm wrong. So I'm just one Hungarian speaker of 9 million, or I don't know however many there is still left of us in the room. But I have kind of noticed that we don't like to be so explicit, and we don't want to insult the reader's intelligence by putting it on the table so clearly and so explicitly. So those Hungarian learners who are following the same mentality or wiring will score badly in task achievement or in
Mm.
task coherence and cohesion, because this is English and this is IELTS and this is a whole other situation, and
Mm.
it's being as explicit, as clear, as planned, and as aware of the task as possible. So that's a sub skill on its own, right? It could easily take up, depending on the group or the learner, not one but many lessons,
Yeah.
and this is not our reality in a lot of classrooms.
I remember the first time I suggested to a teacher that they conduct process writing, and um, I said, but be aware, it's going to take 3, potentially 4 lessons. You know, you're going to go quite deep into this process. And they're like, 3 or 4 lessons on writing. I'm like,
Mm.
and they said, well, I just usually give it for homework. And you know, so I really like that. I think it's an important point that you mentioned, is developing sub skills. And writing is certainly one that is often left. It's sort of, at least from a learner's perspective, they're not that keen on it, but it can be done in quite interesting ways. And in fact, it should be brought into the classroom, as you mentioned, um, and time taken to do it. But not only on writing, as you mentioned, with all the 4 skills, looking at sub skills. Now, thinking about how teachers can get better at teaching for IELTS, or developing skills for exams, I believe that you have a masterclass.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah, so do you want to tell
good.
us a little bit about that?
Yes, happy to. So if people go to my website, fatimelosonci.com, right on the homepage is the link to click on, my masterclass, and it's free of charge for now. And it's an overview of just this, what we've been talking about here concerning testing as opposed to teaching, how they differ, um, and it's not, it's just an awareness raising 60 minutes. So, it's still not teachers watching it will go away, hopefully, having understood that there is more to teaching exams, and in IELTS in particular, than just assigning writing as homework, getting it back, correcting it for the learner, um, and then saying, better luck next time. Because that's, especially with writing, which is the hardest skill, irrespective of mother tongue, as we know, for IELTS. Because not every learner will be capable enough to reverse engineer and to draw the right conclusions from our feedback. Not every learner is autonomous enough to
Mm.
even know how to squeeze enough juice out of that feedback. So this is why it should be happening in class at the
Mm.
beginning, and then we can be more confidently assigning, like, okay, now write, this is the essay, now write 3 different thesis statements. Okay, now write a whole paragraph. Now, and so gradually scaffolding our way all the way up to the final product, in class, and then, as homework as well, possibly. Um, but, holding their hand meanwhile, because if you just leave them to their devices and then give the feedback that they might not care for, because they go for the final band score, that's what concerns them, and they either
Mm.
are happy, for the most part they aren't. That's not really fair.
Mm.
That's not really in many cases. So yeah, people can watch my masterclass for just as an eye opener around this. They can follow me on LinkedIn. I really blog a lot around
Mm.
IELTS and sub skills teaching. Um, but my blog is just my LinkedIn posts
Mm.
for the most part. If people want to check on either platform, they will find the same ideas. And yeah, that's a good starting point. But by understanding, you know, that there is a problem here, that we are testing more than we should, and it can lead to fossilizing, and yeah, that's good enough as a first step
Yeah, yeah.
in many.
Well, I'll definitely make sure to leave links to them, so that people can check them out. Um, one point before we get up onto the book recommendations, um, obviously with tests, um, we're focusing on skill development and language proficiency and stuff like that. What's your perception, or your opinion on developing learners' sort of test taking strategies, their ability to to understand the test itself and see, okay, yes, your language proficiency is great, but you certainly need to know certain perspectives of the test to pass it. What importance of this, or what importance should teachers give to this?
Yeah, that's so true. So, to a large extent, success on an exam will depend on how autonomous the learner is, how well they know the exam, its structure, its timings, its requirements, its criteria as well, but not so thoroughly as we should, their teachers,
Mm,
because it's quite abstract. So bombarding learners with criteria talk, more criteria talk than necessary is maybe not so conducive either. Um, but um, but yeah, just raising their awareness of how, if they have done the PAT, and now they, because a university is asking them to get an IELTS academic band score 7, they are in for a different ride.
mm,
They not rely on the same kind of reading and use of English and grammatical transformation, kind of more isolated, more, still a bit more language for, but there is skills tested obviously in main suite exams, but IELTS is extreme. So it's faster, it's over before you notice it, and you
mm,
don't know it's you. So this is the experience that candidates report back
mm,
after first mock exam, even if they are not taking the real thing, but we just tell them, which I really think we should do, by the way. So I am against only using past papers instead of teaching, but I am very much for diagnostic tests and finding
mm,
out and telling the learner as well that this is where we are at now. So if you insist on taking the exam in 2 weeks, um, we are this is our starting point. So it's
mm.
just worth being realistic at the same time, and share the responsibility with the learner, and not then have to face their disappointment if they don't get the 7 in writing after 2 weeks with us, etc. So it's so the structural components, the timing, the how it's different from other exams they have probably met before or have had
Mm.
experiences with, um, which is what a lot of IELTS teacher training courses do, in my experience, to be honest, especially the simpler ones. And I think it's not cutting it. It's talking about the structure of the exam and timing, um,
But
is
that's
not
one
enough.
element, right? There's more to that, and I think that is, we often talk about course books are de-skilling teachers. Scott Thornbury is quite famous for talking about that. But then we also have this idea of exams. Are exams de-skilling teachers if we're
Mm,
just presenting the exams, right?
mm.
And I have a chat with my teachers there, and I said, okay, yes, there is. We do need to teach the exam, raise awareness of what it is, but we're also developing language proficiency, right? Um, and yeah, as I have noticed that a lot of courses out there, they do focus on, okay, this is the course to teach you about what the exam is, and that's great. But there's more, as you mentioned, especially with looking at that skill development and being able to do that proficiently in class. Um,
without without
yes.
without overdoing the sub skills as well. So teachers sometimes, when they hear about this whole new world of wow, what are they and what's happening? And I'm like, take it easy, just learn a bit about them and use the ones that your learners are struggling with. So the
Mm,
question I get about my bootcamp modules that are becoming self-study, and I'm listening is already available, and I'm in the process of finalizing reading these couple days, and then writing and speaking hopefully in the next 1 or 2 weeks. Is that, yeah, there are 25 problems and some solutions to each. They are really pulled apart, they are really isolated, as they should be. I tried to go deep in my material, at least in terms of inspiring teachers to kind of try to use my exercises and then scaffold it and add to it, and
mm,
use the same exercise type with their course book if there is a useful reading text that they like, but they want to kind of tweak it a bit more. Then there are some ideas on how to do that in my courses. um, but you don't have to go through the 25 sub skills with every single student. You will see from your diagnostics or from a previous exam result they are bringing to you, whether they really struggle with writing, and then which of the two genres, whether it's the report or, and then you will have an idea, and then you will pick and choose the strategies you want to familiarize them with. So
Yeah.
it's not, you have to kind of, it's not a complete course if you haven't showed them the 100 sub skills overall that was in my boot camp that I'm chopping up into self-study modules. No, your learners don't need to know of them all if they're already getting 8 in speaking.
Yeah.
Don't any of them if that's what they need. But you as a practitioner do, because this student might not need this strategy or this kind of help, but another one might welcome. You know, so yeah, it's as we do with any other kind of CPD that we do. We're trying to collect tools with the understanding that we will use them when we need them and when
Yeah.
the learner needs them. By we need them, I mean the learner needs them for the most part, because there is a confusion
Yeah.
around whose need are we talking about. Mhm.
Well, on that, on this idea of developing our knowledge base or our theoretical underpinnings or our awareness of, what sub skills are and so on and so forth, we get to book recommendations, which is, perhaps my favorite part of Sponge Chats. I love books. Um, what what books or resources do you have in mind for teachers out there that would like to develop their assessment literacy, or that would like to develop their understanding of sub skills, what they are for each of the skills? Have you got a number of book recommendations for us?
Yes, I did my homework, teacher. I wrote down
Go.
I wrote down a couple. For IELTS, I am gonna recommend my essay writing book. I'm sorry. I'm not even sorry,
It's
because
completely fine.
I think it's really, really good when I'm getting really good feedback on it, because
Mm,
it goes into sub-skill details, and it's really cheap. You can buy it on Amazon, um, how to teach yourself IELTS essay writing. So there's a yourself in it because it's from the self-study series, and the idea is that learners who are band 6 or above, they can rely on it alone, and if they're autonomous enough, there is an answer key, so they can just study from it, and teachers can use it as well, obviously, with their
yeah.
students to kind of learn what the types of essay are, what a thesis statement is supposed to look like, what a paragraph is, what a paragraph isn't. So just because we visually separated some content from another, it's not a paragraph make in
Mm,
itself. So you need a topic sentence, some supporting sentences, how to create supporting sentences, is one sub skill that the whole lesson could be about. So,
mm,
either by details or examples or explanations, and then we could get our learners to, like, here's a topic sentence written for you already. What, if you had to write two more sentences and you have a word count of 30 words, which is very artificial, but it's a wonderful scaffold
yeah, yeah.
to very mathematically, and then we can throw these tools away. Um, so this is what's all broken down into such granular levels in my book. And for assessment literacy, um, the oldies but goodies, so the classics are, of course, Arthur Hughes' Testing for Language Teachers by
Mm,
CUP. I really, kind of love it, and I learned a lot from it for my Delta, and then and as an assessment practitioner, it's good to kind of have these basics, as well as H. Douglas Brown's language assessment principles, and classroom practices, obviously. So they are, and then the more advanced ones that I'm struggling with. So on long winter days that I'm not having these days would be Rita Green's statistical analysis for language testers, which is full of mathematics. So it's really, really not for the faint of heart, because that's where we are veering more into,
right.
we're in the humanities, and we are kind of
Mm,
transitioning more to the statistical mathematical. But yeah, I'm kind of curious, and I haven't given up yet, although I don't think I'm really good at math. Um, I'd love to be, and I keep picking this book up, and a couple others of the same magnitude, where we're still talking about item writing and all, but more from a mathematical statistical point of view as well. So I'm not
mm,
even going to list those, because I think just having a basic book to do with our profession, ELT in particular, such
yeah.
as Hugh Douglas Brown's, is a good starting point.
Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned some quite big names there. And for most of us that have done like a Delta or an MAT, so you're touching on those quite a lot. And especially those that take the assessment route, such as yourself, right? Um, there's so much to cover though. I remember I interviewed a friend all the way back at the start when I started my blog, Jo Tomlinson, and she works in assessment, and she said there's all sorts of areas that you can work within assessment. So you know what I mean, like in terms of writing the test or looking at the statistics of the test. Yeah, there's so much there. Thinking about you and your career moves to the future, what does the future hold for Fatime?
No idea. I really am um, in love with teacher training and materials design and item writing, and that's what I'm pursuing for now. So I'm finalizing my modules for IELTS teacher training.
Mm,
Might write spin-off courses kind of related to IELTS and moving more closer to item writing perhaps, or even
mm,
skills item writing in particular, which, as we've been talking about, how that's kind of a whole other animal um, that I know something about, not everything, and I'm an upper intermediate practitioner of
mm.
item. So just, speaking of these frameworks and everything as gauging tools, I, I love using them. This is why I'm certificate-aholic in a sense, because it's good to know where we stand. It's good to
Yeah,
stand that, while I was preparing for this exam, and then I did the mock exam and I was like, I'm not quite there yet. Okay, good. Well, what's missing? So, in assessment terms, mathematics, psychometrics, statistics, statistical software, this is all missing from my repertoire. I might or might not have the opportunity or chance or motivation to kind of go into those territories. I don't know yet. But it's good for me to know that they are there. And I don't know, I almost used the bad word. I don't know much about um, not enough. So sometimes
yeah,
our exploration has to start there. Like, what's the territory? And then what are the skills? What are the CPD options, books, courses, reliable practitioners, reputable practitioners? That's often good enough.
yeah, yeah.
So that's a
No, but
vague.
no, but you've taken on something that I hold dear to my heart, and that's this idea that we never stop learning, we can never stop, and that's what we need to recognize as teachers, as teacher educators. There's always more, um, and it's just keeping that passion alive, right?
Yeah, and being selective. So,
Yeah,
referring, like, there is more and more content, there is more and more noise, and more is coming with AI. So the question is going to be, who do we trust? Um, who are holding the torch, and whose signal is the clearest? And
yeah,
so that's going to be a bigger and bigger challenge. So if we just, kind of manage that part of the challenge, to know who to follow and what to believe in, that's often a good starting point. And then we still have to put in the work and actually do the course, actually read the book. Um, but life is so short, to do bad courses and to read books that are misinforming us potentially even, or others. So
yeah.
it's
One
tricky.
hundred percent. I think there's another sponge chat in there for another day somewhere.
Yeah, many. I'm sure.
I I've had it. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you today. So thank you very much for that. I look forward to perhaps having you on here again in another few years, and we'll see how this has progressed, and we'll speak soon. Okay.
Be honored. Thank you for the invitation, Jim. Yeah, really appreciated it.
Brilliant. Bye.
Bye for now.